Okay, so welcome to this video. In this video what we're going to discuss is Huntington's disease, okay, and we're also going to discuss Huntington's disease medications, okay, so the medications used to treat Huntington's disease. Okay, right, so let me describe the structure for this video then. We're going to start off with a broad overview of how Huntington's disease progresses. Okay, so we're going to discuss the symptoms of Huntington's disease at different stages. Okay, and then we're going to finally see how generally it leads to death. Okay, then what we will move on to is we will discuss the neurodegenerative process that underlies Huntington's disease. We'll discuss the genetic basis of Huntington's disease. Okay, and then what we'll move on to is the actual portions of the brain which are affected worst by Huntington's disease. So which portions are particularly susceptible to the neurodegeneration that is seen within Huntington's disease. Okay, and we'll see how the degeneration of those particular brain regions is going to lead to the symptoms of Huntington's disease. Okay, right. Finally, what we'll end with is a discussion of the medications used to treat the symptoms of Huntington's disease. Now, none of the medications that we currently have are capable of stopping the neurodegenerative process. All they do is treat the symptoms. And the two categories of drugs that we're going to discuss, which give symptomatic treatment for Huntington's disease, are dopamine-depleting agents and also the antipsychotic drugs, which are usually used to treat schizophrenia, but which are also effective at treating one of the major symptoms of Huntington's disease. Okay, right, so let's start off then with the core pathology of Huntington's disease. Okay, so firstly, what is the prevalence of Huntington's disease? Okay, so it's around 1 in 10,000 people who suffer from Huntington's disease. Okay, so in the general population, 1 in 10,000 people suffer from Huntington's disease. Okay, so let's now discuss the pathological process. So, when do symptoms start then? Generally they start in the 4th or 5th decade of life. Okay, so the entire process is going to start, well, the entire process, as we will see, starts years and years before, but it's only going to manifest into actual symptoms, generally in the 4th or 5th decade of life. Okay then, so what are the early symptoms of Huntington's disease? Okay, so you've just started to develop the symptoms of Huntington's disease. What are the symptoms that you're going to actually experience? Well, the sort of cardinal symptom of Huntington's disease is what's known as chorea. Okay, also sometimes called Huntington's chorea, because there is chorea that results from different pathologies. Okay, so when you've got chorea that is resulting because of Huntington's disease, it's sometimes called Huntington's chorea. Okay, right, so what does chorea actually mean? Okay, well, chorea refers to involuntary writhing movements, okay, very rapid involuntary writhing movements or jerky movements. So the key words here are involuntary and then writhing, or you can use jerky movements. Okay, so involuntary jerky movements. Now, which areas are particularly affected? Well, generally the neck is often affected. So generally people with Huntington's chorea will be writhing their neck. They'll continuously be moving their head backwards, okay, uncontrollably. Okay, so extending their neck basically. So the neck often writhes about, okay, uncontrollably. In addition, you get jerky movements of the hands and the arms. Okay, so I would think that the writhing description would apply to the neck. Okay, when you see Huntington's chorea occurring in the neck, it really does look like this sort of writhing movement of the neck. Okay, whereas the movements of the hands and the arms are generally more jerky, and you also get movements of the feet and legs as well. Okay, so of the extremities. Okay, right. Now, generally, these involuntary movements that occur in chorea, generally they are worse when you are trying to make a voluntary movement. Okay, so if you're sitting or lying down and you're not trying to actually move, generally then the chorea will be much lower, okay? You might still have some involuntary movements, but they'll generally be much, much subtler. Okay, if you try and make a voluntary movement, okay, so let's say you're trying to reach out and pick something up, then the chorea will get much, much worse. You'll have involuntary jerking movements of the arm that you're trying to move out towards this cup. Okay, so triggered by voluntary movements generally. Okay, you do still have some chorea when you're perfectly at rest, but it's generally much worse when you're trying to make voluntary movements, and we will see an explanation for why that is later on when we actually look at which portion of the brain is going to degenerate most in Huntington's disease. Okay, right, so triggered by voluntary movements. So Huntington's chorea is the cardinal symptom of Huntington's disease, okay, particularly the early phases of Huntington's disease. As we'll see, it spins completely the other way in the later stages of the disease, okay, because chorea is one of the symptoms that will be grouped under this larger category of hyperkinesia. Okay, so this literally just means too much. That's the hyperkinesia movement. So too much movement. You're getting too much movement. You're getting these involuntary movements. Okay, as we'll see, it's going to go in completely the opposite direction in the later stages of the disease. You're going to go from having this hyperkinesia symptom to having a hypokinesia symptom where you've got too little movement and you can't actually initiate voluntary movements anymore. Okay, right. So, before though we go on to the later stages of the disease, let's talk about the other symptoms of the early Huntington's disease. Okay, so the other key symptoms of the early Huntington's disease are that cognition begins to fail. Okay, so you start to notice deficits in cognition. Now, what sort of processes then are described as cognitive processes? What does this word actually mean? Okay, well, let me give you some examples of processes that we view as cognitive processes. Okay, so one term is executive control. Okay, so let me define what executive control is. Executive control is decision making. Okay, the control over what you're going to do. So when you wake up in the morning and decide what you're going to do today, that is you using your executive control, the planning of what you're going to do, the decision making. Okay, that's what we mean by executive control, and that's viewed as a cognitive process. Okay, so let me give you other examples of cognitive processes. Okay, so another example of a cognitive process is problem solving. Okay, which is exactly what it says. It's your ability to solve problems. So when you're confronted with some sort of problem, being able to work your way through that problem and come to a solution. Okay, that's an example of a cognitive process. Language is also viewed as a cognitive process, okay, and that means not only being able to speak, not only being able to actually create language, but also being able to understand other people's speech, so being able to interpret language. Okay, that's counted as a cognitive process. Okay, other examples of cognitive processes are calculation. Okay, so being able to calculate what 5 times 4 is and things like that, or maybe something more like that, maybe something like calculating 348 times 1294, something like that in your head. Okay, that would be a cognitive process. Okay, and then another example, and my final example, is visuospatial perception. Okay, so what's meant by visuospatial perception? Visuospatial perception is being able to visualize three-dimensional space in your head. Okay, so being able to lie on your bed, let's say, and visualize walking down some street that you've walked down many years before, maybe, okay, and being able to visualize your way somewhere, maybe, okay, that sort of three-dimensional visualization, that's what's known as visuospatial perception, okay, and that's also a cognitive process. Okay, so all of these processes are considered cognition, basically. So when I say cognition is falling, I mean that all of these sort of processes are going down, basically. Your ability to solve problems, your ability to make plans, especially your ability to make plans, suffers in Huntington's disease. Okay, right. So those are the early stages of the disease. You notice deficits in cognition, and then the cardinal symptom is the chorea, the involuntary writhing and jerky movements. Okay, right. So now let's talk about the later stages of the disease. Okay, and the marked thing that occurs in the later stages of the disease is that rather than having the hypokinesia, rather than having the chorea where you've got too much movement, you've got these involuntary movements that you have no control over, instead you go the opposite way. You find it very difficult to move at all. Okay, so the plus is that at least the involuntary movements do stop. Okay, but the problem is that you can no longer make voluntary movements really at all. Okay, so you develop hypokinesia. Okay, which doesn't just mean too little movement. It means inability to make voluntary movements. Okay, so you really struggle to actually make voluntary movements. Okay, so this is very similar to Parkinson's disease, okay, where the cardinal symptom of Parkinson's disease is hypokinesia. You lose the ability to make voluntary movements, and we're going to see that the same circuits are involved in Huntington's disease as are involved in Parkinson's disease. Okay, in Parkinson's disease it's all going to be about the substantia nigra pars compacta degenerating. In Huntington's disease, a different bit of the circuit is going to degenerate, and we'll see all of this later on. Okay, right. So initially you get the chorea, and then it propagates onto this hypokinesia, and we will see exactly what is happening that causes this evolution from chorea to this hypokinesia. Okay, right. In addition, I'm afraid the cognitive deficits get worse, okay, and you start to get full-blown dementia. Okay, so what do people mean when they say dementia? Well, there's three sort of cardinal symptoms of dementia. The first is that cognition is just broken, basically. All of these things that I've described here are really starting to be lost, basically. Okay. In addition, memory is starting to break as well. So declarative memory, consciously recallable memories are starting to be lost. Okay. And finally, even personality changes start to occur in dementia. Okay. So those are the three sort of main parts of dementia. Okay, right. And in addition, you can even get affective disorders as well. Okay. Now, this is the one bit we're not going to be able to explain with what I'm going to tell you. Okay, we're going to see explanations for all of these other symptoms from which bits of the brain degenerate in Huntington's disease. Okay, the affective disorders, they will be due to other portions degenerating potentially. Okay. However, the main affective disorder that you get in Huntington's disease, and it's not always present, but generally you get depression. Okay. Now, what does depression mean? Well, the main symptom of depression is that you have a mood that is described as dysphoric. Okay, so dysphoria, which means that your mood is always bad, basically. You're always either feeling very sad, or you're feeling angry and irritable. Okay, so it's a bad mood permanently, basically. Okay, and that's what's happening in depression. And that's another symptom in the later stages of Huntington's disease. Okay, and again, that will be resulting from other portions of the brain degenerating. Okay, right. So, now the final thing I want to say is that unfortunately Huntington's disease is usually fatal. It does usually result in death. Okay, so generally, however, it's a long time after the initial onset of the disease. Okay, so from the initial time when you were first beginning to experience symptoms of Huntington's disease, it generally takes around 15 to 20 years to actually result in death. So 15 to 20 years after the onset of the disease, you're going to get death. Now, what is the general cause of death in people with Huntington's disease? Well, It's aspiration pneumonia. Okay, now let me explain why. Well, actually, let me first explain what aspiration pneumonia is. So there are many different types of pneumonia. Aspiration pneumonia means that you have inhaled something, okay, and this has caused inflammation of the lungs, okay. So aspirate is just another word for inhale. Okay, so you could call this inhalation pneumonia, to use a more common word. Okay, now generally what do you inhale? You inhale food or drink generally. Okay, and this then causes inflammation of the alveoli. Pneumonia just means that you're getting inflammation of the alveoli. Okay, so you manage to inhale some sort of food bolus or some sort of drink, and this is going to trigger inflammation of the alveoli. So I'll just highlight this up. This is alveolar inflammation, and the problem with alveolar inflammation, and I'm not going to be able to fit it in there, okay, the problem with alveolar inflammation is it fills the alveoli with fluid, okay, and if the alveoli are full of fluid, you're not going to be getting very good gas exchange, so generally it can really compromise gas exchange, and that's what leads to the death. Okay, if the respiratory system fails, you're going to die, basically. So that's what it leads to, respiratory failure. Okay, right, so why do people with Huntington's disease generally get aspiration pneumonia? Okay, well generally one of the things that the late stage of Huntington's disease causes is difficulty in swallowing. Okay, now there's a fancy word for difficulty in swallowing, it's called dysphagia. So dysphagia means problems with swallowing, and this means that when you're eating and drinking, you can end up getting food going down the windpipe rather than down the esophagus, okay, and then of course it can end up in the lungs, trigger an inflammatory response, okay, and that's the pneumonia. Right, okay, and that's the main way that people with Huntington's disease actually die. Okay, right, so that then is the overall progression of Huntington's disease. Okay, what we're going to turn our attention to now is the neurodegenerative process itself. Okay, now, let me just remind you of the structure then that we're going to follow. We're going to talk about the neurodegenerative process itself first, and then we're going to look at the genetic underpinnings of this, okay? And then, after we've looked at the neurodegenerative process, or at least what is known about the neurodegenerative process, then we'll go back and we'll study which areas of the brain are affected worst by this neurodegenerative process and how that leads to the symptoms that we are seeing here, okay? Because fundamentally these symptoms don't result because of the biochemical process, they are resulting because the nerves have died because of this biochemical process, and then you're losing huge chunks of the brain basically, okay? And that's what causes these symptoms. Okay, so we'll start with the neurodegenerative process and then we'll study which portions of the brain are going to die and then how that's going to result in these symptoms that we are seeing here. Okay, right. So then, the neurodegeneration itself, and I think I should write the word neurodegeneration at one point. Okay, so neurodegeneration means neurons dying, okay, and therefore portions of the brain visibly atrophying, getting smaller, wasting away. Okay, right. So, what is the cause then of the neurodegeneration in Huntington's disease? Okay, well, Huntington's disease is fundamentally a genetic disease, okay? You can have your genome screened and they can tell you whether you will get Huntington's disease or not, okay? In principle, we could go around every primary school in this country, okay, and screen the children for Huntington's disease and tell them whether they're going to get Huntington's disease or not. And this isn't a, you've got a risk of getting Huntington's disease. We can tell you if you are going to get Huntington's disease or not. There is a little crossover in the middle where you're at risk of getting Huntington's disease. But if you've got a certain allele of Huntingtin, which we'll come on to in a moment, okay, we can tell you that you will get Huntington's disease within your lifetime. Okay, providing you live a normal lifespan. Okay, the reason we don't do that at present is because we have not got any magic drug that we can give to you to stop you getting the disease. So we literally would just be giving bad news for the sake of giving bad news, and that's why it's not at present done. Okay, it's where genomics has overtaken actual medicine, basically. We can tell you whether you're going to get Huntington's disease, but we can't do anything to actually stop you getting it. So at present, obviously, we don't tell people whether they're going to get Huntington's disease or not. Okay, right. So let's now look at the biochemistry of what happens in Huntington's disease. So it's all about a protein called Huntingtin, okay, which is a protein that is found in all cells of the body, and that's actually important. It's a curious fact. Okay, it's found in pretty much every cell within the body, and it's found within the cytoplasm. Okay, right. Now, the function of it is not known. Okay, so function not known. Okay, however, we do know a lot about its structure. It seems to have some important function because it's present in all cells in the cytoplasm, okay? But we don't actually know what that function is at present. Right, so let me discuss the structure then of this protein Huntingtin. Okay, so we're only going to discuss the first bit of the structure. So if we draw our Huntingtin protein here, let's say this is the amino terminus here, and this is the C terminus here. Now, the only portion that we're going to need to know about is something known as the Polyglutamine Tract. Okay, now let me show you where this is. This is very close to the amino terminus of Huntingtin. Okay, in fact, there's 17 amino acids prior to this polyglutamine tract here. Okay, and that group of 17 amino acids from the amino terminus up to the beginning of this polyglutamine tract, that is known as the N17 for the amino terminal 17 amino acids. Okay, so that little bit right there, that's known as the N17 region. Now, after the N17 region, this bit that I have boxed and now highlighted in blue, this is the portion that we're going to be incredibly interested in. Okay, this is known as the polyQ tract. Okay, now why is it called the polyQ tract? Well, Q is the single letter code for glutamine. Okay, so basically this section is just glutamine after glutamine after glutamine after glutamine. Now let me just remind you of the structure of the amino acid glutamine. So I'll draw it here. Right, so I'll draw this as an amino acid residue rather than as a free amino acid. So that means that I'm going to show this amino acid as though it's bound within a polypeptide rather than as a free amino acid. Okay, so here's the amino group here. Okay, and it will be bound to the carboxylic acid group of the amino acid prior to it. Here's the alpha carbon with a hydrogen coming off. Here's the carboxylic acid group, and the carboxylic acid group will then be bound to the amino group of the next amino acid along. Okay, now, the R group then of glutamine consists of a primary amide, and then you've got an ethylene group before the primary amide group. Okay, so here is the ethylene group, two methylene groups joined together, and now you're going to have the primary amide group here. So here's the carboxylic acid carbon with its double bond to its oxygen atom, and then you're going to have the amino group coming off here. Okay, and that's a primary amide group there. Okay, so this is the R group then of the amino acid glutamine. Okay, and the single letter code for glutamine is Q. Right, so this is glutamine, and it's got this amide group. That's the interesting functional group that this has. Okay, so this is called an amide group, and it's actually specifically a primary amide group because the nitrogen atom has two hydrogens attached to it. If it had other things attached on here, then it wouldn't be a primary amide group. Okay, right. So in this polyglutamine or polyQ tract, you're going to have glutamine followed by glutamine followed by glutamine followed by glutamine. So if we zoom in, okay, if this is the polyglutamine tract zoomed in here in blue, what you're going to have is glutamine amino acid. So let's say this one's a glutamine amino acid, followed by another glutamine amino acid, followed by another glutamine amino acid, and it will go on and on and on. Now the question is, how long is this polyglutamine tract? Well, that depends on who you are. It's a different length in different people. Okay, right. Now, if your polyglutamine tract in your Huntingtin proteins is between 6 and 35 glutamines long, okay, Q long, then that's normal. Your Huntingtin will function perfectly fine and you will not get Huntington's disease, okay. If your polyglutamine tract is between 36 and 39, this is that region where you are at risk, but you are not certain to get the disease. At risk, okay, so this is the length where we can't really say whether you're going to get Huntington's disease or not. If, however, your polyglutamine tract is greater than 40 glutamines long, you will get Huntington's disease if you have a normal lifespan. Of course, if you die at 20, okay, because of some other horrible disease, then you're not going to get Huntington's disease, even if you had a Huntingtin protein with a polyglutamine tract of length greater than 40. Okay, it's if you live a normal human lifespan. Okay, so if you get into your 4th and 5th decades, then you will develop Huntington's disease. Okay, and this is 100%, okay, this isn't a risk thing, this is you will get Huntington's disease. Okay, right, now, remember you have 2 genes for Huntington's disease, okay? Now, the genes are present on chromosome 4, okay? Now, you will have 2 copies of chromosome 4 because we are all diploid. So in every single one of the cells within your body, apart from your gametes, okay, so your sperm or your egg cells, okay, you will have 2 copies of chromosome 4. Okay, so I'll just draw the chromosome 4s. Okay, so chromosomes have this distinctive structure where they have a thinning in the middle, okay, a narrowing in the middle known as the centromere. So this is the centromere of chromosome 4, and it splits chromosome 4 into 2 portions, the short arm here, which is known as the P arm, okay, and the long arm here, which is the Q arm. Okay, now, you have 2 chromosome 4s, so I'll show the other one here. Now, the gene for Huntingtin, okay, which is known as the Huntington's disease gene, okay, the HD gene, okay, it's located on the P arm, the short arm of chromosome 4. Now, each one of your chromosome 4s is going to have this Huntington's disease gene, so I'll colour them in here in red, okay. Now, you only need one of these genes to code for a Huntingtin protein with too many glutamines in the polyglutamine tract for you to get Huntington's disease. You don't need both of them to have to be coding for Huntingtin proteins which have polyglutamine tracts containing greater than 40 repeats of the glutamine, okay? You only need one, and that means that Huntington's disease is autosomal dominant, okay? So autosomal just refers to the fact that it's on an autosome. The gene is on an autosome, which means it's on chromosome 1 to 22 rather than on one of the sex chromosomes, okay? And it's also dominant because you only need one copy of a defective Huntington's disease gene, okay? So you only need one copy of a gene which is going to code for a Huntingtin protein with a polyglutamine tract of length greater than 40 in order for you to actually get the disease. Now, let's think a little bit about the genetics a little bit more. Okay, so if I show some DNA here, so let's let these 2 parallel lines here represent a double-stranded piece of DNA. Okay, the DNA is going to code for this Huntingtin protein rather. Okay, so let's say that this is the HD gene, the Huntington's disease gene, which is coding for the protein Huntingtin. Okay, so the portion that actually codes for this polyglutamine tract then, what is its sequence going to be? Well, remember each amino acid in a polypeptide is coded for by 3 organic bases in the DNA. Okay, not just one organic base, you need a triplet code. Okay, so each one of these glutamines is going to be coded for by 3 organic bases, okay, and basically throughout the entire polyglutamine tract, the same combination of 3 organic bases is used to make each of the glutamines, Okay, so let me show you the sequence in the RNA, however, rather than the sequence in the DNA, okay, because that's the sequence that people refer to when they refer to the triplet code that is going to code for the glutamine. So what will happen then is, if just to remind you of the central dogma of biology, what will happen is the DNA will get transcribed. Okay, so here now is a piece of mRNA being produced. Okay, and this piece of mRNA will then be read by a ribosome to produce the polypeptide. Okay, and basically, in the portion that's going to code for the polyglutamine tract, you have the same repeat of 3 organic bases. Okay, and this is the CAG repeat. So you repeat CAG over and over again. Okay, and this one will code for a glutamine. This one will code for a glutamine, and it will go on and on and on. So the CAG will code again for a glutamine, okay, and on and on and on. So this combination of 3 organic bases, cytidine followed by adenine followed by guanine, codes for glutamine. Okay. Right, now you are going to see an analogous code within the DNA, but it won't be on the coding strand, because remember, the coding strand is going to be complementary to the mRNA. It will actually be on the non-coding strand, the strand that was complementary to the coding strand and therefore had the same sequence of organic bases as the mRNA, which is why I didn't want to complicate it by showing you it on the DNA. So instead I thought I'd show it on the mRNA here. Okay, so basically, on the mRNA, you're going to have this repeat of CAG many times, which will code for the polyglutamine tract. Okay, right. This is why Huntington's disease is known as a trinucleotide repeat disease. Okay, because it is caused by having too many trinucleotide repeats, too many of these CAG repeats in the Huntington's disease gene. Okay, so that's why it's called a trinucleotide repeat disease, resulting from too many of these trinucleotide repeats. So the CAG, this is a trinucleotide, 3 nucleotide repeat. Okay, right. So, if in your genome you have a Huntington's disease gene where you have greater than 40 of these trinucleotide repeats, then that will code for a Huntingtin protein with greater than 40 glutamines in the polyglutamine tract, and that Huntingtin protein is then going to lead to you getting Huntington's disease. Okay, right. Now, let me talk a little bit more about this. Okay, so there are no sporadic cases of Huntington's disease. Instead, you have to have had this mutation from being a zygote. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, so when your father's sperm fused with your mother's egg to make you, okay, you then have the fertilized egg here. So here's the nucleus with the full copy of chromosomes in. Okay, so this now is what's known as the zygote, the fertilized egg. Okay, and basically the mutation for Huntington's disease has to be present in your DNA from this stage in order for you to get Huntington's disease. It's no good you developing with perfectly healthy genes and then getting a mutation in the genes in one cell, let's say in your body, which gives you a faulty Huntington protein. It has to be from the zygote here. Okay, so it has to start at the stage of the zygote here. Okay, right. So I think we will call it there for this video, and we'll continue this discussion in the next video, okay, where we'll firstly discuss in more detail what I mean by the not being sporadic cases of Huntington's disease.